April 1945, Philippine Islands, the war had fallen into its final shadows. The humid air of the Luzon hills was thick with smoke and surrender. Burnt sugar, gun oil, and the faint hum of flies circling open cans of rations. In the distance, a generator coughed to life, flickering light across the canvas roofs of a hastily built American prisoner compound. Guards moved with weary precision, checking fences that sagged under the storm of war's ending. At the western edge, a small group of Japanese women, nurses of the Imperial Army Medical Corps, captured during the retreat, stood motionless. Their uniforms were wrinkled, armbands stained with iodine and dust. Weeks of captivity had dulled their fear into silence. Then, in an almost dreamlike turn, they saw something they could not immediately comprehend. At the open mess shelter, American men and women sat together at long wooden tables. Aluminum trays gleamed under weak lantern light. They spoke softly, ate from the same bread ration, drank coffee from tin mugs. Women laughed, soldiers passed the milk. No separation, no rank, no shame. To the Japanese prisoners, it looked like a quiet impossibility. The sight of men and women sharing food, without codes or curfews, carried the weight of cultural shock deeper than any battlefield shell. For the first time since their capture, they were seeing the war's other world. Not in a pamphlet, but alive before their eyes. That unsettling vision of shared humanity. Simple, almost tender, would mark the beginning of a quiet transformation that rippled far beyond that small camp near Liberation. The question, now, was how such a meal could challenge an empire's ideas of honor, power, and womanhood itself. By the spring of 1945, Japan's once sprawling empire had been reduced to fragments. Manila was in ruins. The Pacific Islands, those coral-rimmed strongholds that once formed the empire's outer wall, had been taken one by one. In these final months, thousands of Japanese soldiers and auxiliary personnel, including hundreds of women serving as nurses, clerks, and communication orderlies, were captured by Allied forces. Their surrender was reluctant, sometimes involuntary, often hidden behind an instinctive sense of disgrace, taught since childhood. For these women, captivity was a stranger's word. Japanese wartime doctrine left little room for survival through surrender. From their earliest training, they were told that capture meant dishonor worse than death. A woman who yields, read one military handbook, brings shame upon her nation's soul. Many carried small grenades or morphine tablets, insurance against humiliation. Yet on Luzon, Leyte, and Okinawa, when the front collapsed too fast for ritualized death, some nurses chose to live. Exhaustion, disease, or the presence of civilian patients stripped away the option of self-destruction, leaving them breathing amid defeat. The Allied camps that received them were pragmatic creations. Rows of tents or bamboo huts, barbed wire perimeters, guarded gates, and medical wards set up under the Red Cross. The U.S. Army, long experienced in prisoner management by 1945, divided responsibilities carefully. Officers in khaki handled registrations and interrogations. Medical staff distributed quinine, sulfa, and the most precious commodity of all, clean water. Compared to the terror Japanese propaganda had instilled about barbaric Americans, the compound was strikingly ordinary. Its rhythms were military, not malevolent. Yet beyond logistics loomed a deeper divide: ideology. Within Japan's social order, men and women occupied separate planets. Loyalty flowed upward to the emperor, then horizontally to the male head of family or unit. Women's role was service, visible devotion, invisible self. Eating separately from men was a ritualized form of modesty that reinforced this cosmic arrangement. Even within hospitals, off-duty female nurses took their meals apart from male officers, a habit derived from centuries of hierarchical etiquette. At the moment of their imprisonment, that ideology seemed intact. The captured nurses expected the Americans to feed them last, to treat them as curiosities, or worse, to use them for propaganda. Instead, they were processed like any other prisoners of war, logged under non-combat personnel. They filled forms, received basic rations, powdered eggs, canned beans, faintly sweet bread that smelled of yeast and something foreign. Hunger drowned the shame of eating it. American camp design itself carried symbolic weight. The typical mess line was an egalitarian space. Tin trays passed from one pair of hands to the next, regardless of nationality or gender. In the Pacific, where female U.S. Army nurses and Red Cross workers assisted, the sight of uniformed women sharing the same benches as men embodied a quiet revolution of its own. It represented not permissiveness, but parity, a reflection of the society that spawned what Japanese prisoners would later call the strange democracy of the table. To Japanese eyes, this was disorienting. For years, wartime propaganda had painted U.S. society as morally deluded, its women corrupted by materialism. Film reels imported through the Ministry of Information showed short-skirted dancers in New York nightclubs, while narrators spoke gravely of Western decay. Yet reality at the camp contradicted everything in those reels. American female nurses tended soldiers' wounds with authority and calm, their voices firm. Male privates addressed them as equals, ma'am, and lieutenant. Discipline, not chaos, governed the place. There was statistical order to confirm it. By early 1945, more than 77,000 American women were serving overseas in the Women's Army Corps, the Army Nurse Corps, and Navy Waves. Their presence within war zones testified to a mobilization that blurred traditional lines of gender for efficiency's sake. In contrast, Imperial Japan's female wartime service, though courageous, was framed as extension of motherhood, sacrifice without recognition. Thus, when these worlds collided within the fences of captivity, the shock was inevitable. The prisoners' expectations of segregation, subservience, perhaps abuse, met a system inadvertently designed to contradict them. The Americans, hardened by campaigns from New Guinea to Iwo Jima, no longer saw gender as a luxury to uphold. Survival demanded function. In the evenings, as the compound's single loudspeaker played faint dance tunes from a scratchy record for morale, the Japanese nurses huddled by their tents, whispering among themselves. They dissected what they had seen, the gestures between male and female staff, the unspoken equality in posture. At first they saw impropriety. Later, they saw confidence. The transformation began quietly, through observation before understanding. The next day would confront them with a clearer example, an invitation they neither sought nor expected, to eat alongside their captors, under the same roof, from the same pot of coffee. In that invitation lay the seed of revelation that would ripple through the ideology of a defeated empire. The camp's morning bell rang at 6. Its sound, metal on metal, spread through the misty valley with mechanical regularity. To the Japanese prisoners, it was both familiar and foreign. Familiar because they had lived by bells for years, but foreign because this one signaled not obedience to an emperor, but the beginning of another day lived under strangers' discipline. Order in the American prisoner compounds was designed less as punishment than containment. Each day unfolded through routines standardized by policy. Réveillé, medical inspection, roll call, rations, rest. The United States, drawing upon the 1929 Geneva Convention, emphasized measured humane treatment. In the Pacific hinterlands, that principle was tested but rarely abandoned. For captured women, special quarters were arranged, makeshift though they were, with canvas separating sleeping spaces, assigned guards trained to minimize contact. There was structure, but not menace. Yet understanding the meaning of that structure required context inside Japan itself. Since the Meiji Restoration, cultural norms had reinforced a doctrine known as Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, Franisiti Kametius, Sandri Chudse, wise mother. Military training manuals for women's auxiliaries and nurses expanded this into wartime ideology. The ideal female patriot existed in total relational terms. Her purpose was to serve, to nurture sacrifice, never to claim equality. The Imperial rescript on education, recited through childhood, declared that harmony and hierarchy were twin mandates. Authority flowed uninterrupted. To imagine a society where women could supervise men or share a table with them outside family was to imagine something unnatural. By 1945, that mental code still held even among the educated corps. Interviews conducted after the war, particularly those archived by the Allied translator and interpreter section, documented recurring astonishment among female prisoners. One stated succinctly, "They, the American women, spoke to men without fear. It was as though they had never been taught silence." Another remembered observing a U.S. nurse correct a corporal's bandage technique. "No man in our hospitals would have allowed such words." Food became the stage upon which these invisible codes collided. Supplies at the compound came largely through American logistical abundance, the same system that filled Liberty ships across the Pacific with tins of Spam, powdered milk, citrus concentrate, wheat flour, and coffee. Among the Japanese nurses, coffee was the most symbolic. They had brewed barley tea or rice water in field hospitals, bitter and thin. When handed a ladle of dark coffee, they almost recoiled. It looked like medicine, but the Americans drank it constantly, morning, noon, and night. It was fuel, ritual, identity. The smell seeped through the camp, heavy and earthy, fusing with dew and diesel. That scent became their first enduring symbol of another civilization's rhythm. War records quantify this abundance. By 1945, a single American infantry division consumed roughly 45 tons of food daily, equivalent to the rations of an entire Japanese regiment for 3 days. Supply superiority shaped more than bellies. It altered morale, defined power. To the Japanese prisoners, observing such provisioning contradicted everything they had been told about the enemy's decadence. The Americans were well fed, yes, but not gluttonous. Rather, their orderliness around food reflected efficiency, not indulgence. Anthropologists later analyzing occupation testimonies described these cross-cultural impressions as ideological inversion. Watching men and women eat together in discipline, coordination forced Japanese women to examine internalized associations, that mixing genders represented chaos, and that abundance necessarily bred weakness. Instead, what they saw was balance, people acting without rigid fear. The bowl of stew or cup of coffee became a type of democratic altar, symbolic not only of nourishment, but of parity. Meanwhile, the Americans themselves were largely unaware of the mental shock they produced. To them, the image of a nurse eating beside a soldier was unremarkable. Army Nurse Corps training had normalized gender proximity under fire. These women had served on evacuation vessels, field hospitals, tent wards. They were professionals, not novelties. Few noticed the Japanese prisoners watching from a distance, collecting small details that upended lifetimes of instruction. The historical record captures this distance subtly. In letters home, American nurses in the Philippines mentioned Jap nurse prisoners appearing timid, polite, almost ghostly. One wrote that she wished they could see that we meant them no harm. Her assumption of normality, the absence of malice, was the same force that amplified the prisoner's wonder. Ordinary decency became revolutionary in context. The gradual exposure continued over weeks. Each administrative task carried lessons, registration under female clerks, medical examinations overseen by U.S. nurses using the same stethoscopes on captives and captors alike, brief distribution talks led by both male and female officers. Every instance of parity fed an accumulation of cognitive dissonance. Ideology rarely shatters in a single flash. It corrodes under persistent evidence. By mid-April, the camp had settled into routine. Disease rates dropped, fevers subsided, conversations tentatively emerged between bilingual interpreters and Japanese prisoners. Translation sessions recorded by the 8th Army's Psychological Warfare Branch noted repeated curiosity about the status of women in America. What began as incredulity turned into inquiry. For the first time, the captives asked questions not about release dates, but about customs, education, family, work. The simple question of shared meals was their lens into a vast, unimagined social structure. Beyond the wire, the war neared its end. Tokyo lay under nightly bombing. Okinawa flared red against the sea. Yet within this small camp, just one among hundreds scattered across the Pacific, a quiet revolution, cultural, not military, was unfolding fork by fork, cup by cup. It occurred without speeches or re-education programs, germinating through observation and taste, through a consciousness beginning to loosen from its prescribed certainties. From the perspective of later historians, this moment reveals an irony deeper than battlefield strategy, that even in defeat, Japan's encounter with the idea of equality did not come through occupation policy or propaganda films, but through the simple sight and scent of breakfast shared by men and women in uniform under a makeshift tin roof. That human closeness, at first misunderstood, would soon become central to the prisoners' emotional reckoning and lay foundation for the transformation that defined their post-war lives. The transformation began not in shouting or ideology, but in watching. At the height of war, these women had been trained to see the Americans through a single lens: materialistic, weak, lacking spirit. Now, each routine at the compound stripped away another layer of myth. Historians examining camp diaries would later categorize the experience through several angles: the human, the cultural, and the social, each revealing how perception shifts under simple, persistent evidence. At first, emotional exhaustion dominated. The captured nurses had spent years immersed in carnage, serving in malaria-ridden jungles or bomb-scarred ward tents with little medicine and less sleep. Surrender had hollowed them. Captivity replaced fear of death with the delicate panic of existing in moral limbo. They expected contempt. Instead, routines of civilization returned. They were issued soap, toothbrushes, cotton bandages, and clean linen. Such small gestures struck deeper than lectures. A 1946 Red Cross report recounts a nurse at a Philippine camp remarking, "Until I washed my hands with American soap, I had forgotten the smell of being human." Humanity, slowly restored by touch and texture, allowed emotional contrast to emerge. These women had tended the dying in bomb shelters without complaint, believing in noble despair. That despair now eroded amid ordinary kindness. Guards offered cigarettes without suspicion. Medical officers took pulses gently, and no one shouted shame. Beneath the barbed wire grew unfamiliar relief, the permission to breathe without hierarchy. Observation soon gave way to comparison. Camp daily life was organized around repetition. Reveille at 6, breakfast by 7, inspection at 8. Meals served as social access. To prisoners used to serving men and waiting aside, the American arrangement negated every social code drilled into them. Men and women in khaki queued together, mess tins balanced in mutual impatience. No female subservience, no masculine preeminence, just fatigue and appetite treated equally. Contemporary military guidelines confirmed this. The U.S. Army Mess Manual of 1944 forbade segregation by gender except where quarters required privacy. Equality was administrative, not ideological. Yet, to the observers, it felt moral. Language barriers heightened the theater. When American nurses exchanged casual jokes with enlisted men, the tone carried something revolutionary. Friendship unpoisoned by status. For Japanese women conditioned by hierarchical speech patterns where every syllable signified rank, such informality suggested anarchy. But anarchy it was not. It was comfort built from shared ordeal. Over days, unfamiliar laughter echoed from the mess tent, light and unburdened. Prisoners lingered near fences to listen. Some smiled without meaning to. Others turned away, unsettled by envy more than disbelief. Inside that fence, roles inverted. American female personnel held authority without borrowing male permission. They administered vaccines, compiled rosters, signed orders. To Japanese officers who had considered women auxiliaries existing within paternal oversight, it appeared as quiet rebellion. Yet its discipline defied the word. Rebellion? It was procedural respect. Rank assigned to T2 and competence. Sociologists analyzing the 1945–47 occupation years later identified moments like these as proto-exposure to democratic practice. Equality modeled densely, not verbally preached. Captured nurses, raised to honor hierarchy even in thought, witnessed a chain of command that included women and did not collapse. They began to detect difference between humiliation and humility, between losing a war and discovering another way to organize human worth. Every ideology contains self-defense mechanisms. At first, the prisoners explained their captors' behavior as deception. Surely, they reasoned, such civility masked ulterior motives. But months passed. Suspicion lost momentum. The pattern did not shatter. Custodians rotated, but treatment remained measured. The consistency itself eroded disbelief. When American nurses treated a Japanese prisoner's infection with the same thoroughness as an ally's, onlookers sensed not propaganda, but habit. Goodness as routine, a dangerous idea within systems built on fear. Psychological war diaries from the Allied translators and interpreters section note that by mid-April, Japanese women prisoners displayed marked increase in conversational initiative and lowered avoidance behavior. In plain terms, their walls were cracking. Reality, experienced daily, outweighed indoctrination whispered for decades. Among all symbols, coffee remained constant. Morning steam rose from kettles. Its aroma defined camp life. For Americans, it was energy. For Japanese eyes unused to abundance, it became paradox. They associated that smell with the captor's world. Restless, industrious, equalizing. In later testimonies, multiple prisoners pinpointed their first taste of black coffee as the moment they stood between worlds. Its bitterness was freedom's flavor, uncomfortable yet irresistible. The kernel of democratic symbolism resided not in speeches, but in that cup, passed over a table shared by men, women, victors, and the defeated. By late April, observation matured into comprehension. These prisoners no longer simply watched, they interpreted. What once appeared moral weakness now mirrored humanity's broader strength, the ability to share space and sustenance without shame. This insight, still fragile, awaited a catalyst. A single day when barriers truly dissolved. That catalyst arrived soon after, when a rain shower drove the prisoners under the same roof as their guards for the midday meal. And the unthinkable quietly happened. By late June 1945, the smell of surrender drifted thick as diesel. American patrols advanced through the ruins of Okinawa, and, on the mainland, Tokyo's firestorms erased districts overnight. Inside the prisoner camps scattered across the Philippine archipelago, routine persisted, scheduled, methodical, detached from the noise of a collapsing empire. But one midday, ordinary on the calendar yet monumental in consequence, became the still point around which dozens of later testimonies would revolve. It began with a bulletin posted on the administrative board. Japanese medical personnel to assist U.S. Army nurses in sanitation procedures, Mess 3, 1,300 hours. To the Americans, a pragmatic assignment. To the prisoners, an event without precedent. They were being invited not merely to eat in the same shelter, but to work in the same space, to sanitize tables, to prepare post-meal cleaning alongside American women in uniform. No spectatorship now, participation. Reign threatened, again that symbolic equalizer. The prisoners, around 24 female nurses from field hospitals on Luzon and Davao, filed toward Mess 3. Their footsteps compressed mud into memory. Guards, wet-shouldered, carried buckets. American nurses carried clipboards. For once, rank diffused into cooperation. A Red Cross observer, Lieutenant Anne McRae, recorded in her diary what she witnessed. They entered shyly, bowing with that careful formality, as though approaching a shrine. Within minutes, we were laughing over rags and swaps of soap bars. It felt like housekeeping in peacetime. Her words, simple, domestic, capture the crucial inversion. The POW camp, supposed theater of humiliation, transformed into a workshop of parity. Coffee reasserted its rule as the universal mediator. An electric urn, dented but faithful, gurgled near the hatch. Steam rose like incense, gray against the lamplight gloom. An American nurse poured and motioned for her Japanese counterpart to join. Pause. Then, acceptance. One cup placed upon another without tremor. The prisoner drank. Observers later said she smiled faintly, whispered "Kuroi amai," black and sweet, a phrase quickly repeated by those around her, its foreign sweetness translating without grammar. The sound of shared laughter followed, quiet but resonant. It was not alliance. It was the rediscovery of plain human voice. From such fleeting exchanges sprouted irreversible change. Months later, when interviewed by occupation sociologists, many of these same women identified that communal inspection day as the hour the war ended inside us. Data from a 1947 Tokyo University survey supports the claim. Fully 62% of repatriated female prisoners reported their first positive view of American values, derived from camp experiences involving collective work or meals unsegregated by gender. 30D seats. Statistical precision hides human emotion, but therein lies the historian's clue. Transformation is measurable when multiplied. Outside the wire, ideological walls cracked in parallel. American propaganda broadcasts shifted tone from aggression to reconstruction, stressing cooperation rather than punishment. Inside the camp, the microcosm anticipated the macrocosm. Here, cooperation was no slogan. It took physical form, splashing soap, drying tables, sharing coffee under military tin roofing. Witness accounts confirm subtle miracles. One Japanese nurse, formerly faithful to the Imperial rescript, broke down while folding cloth beside an American woman, repeating, "I thought we were demons to you." The American, unsure what was spoken, only patted the prisoner's sleeve and smiled. No word translated. Sentiment did. That gesture, trivial in execution, seismic in implication, penetrated decades of isolation. At 1300 hours, it was merely cleaning. By 1400, it had become ceremony. When both groups stood for roll call afterward, those who understood English joined in the simple word present. A single syllable shared without hierarchy, an echo across languages, signifying not surrender, but mutual existence. Historical observers from the Eighth Army would describe these small integrations as unofficial diplomacy. Indeed, what weapons failed to articulate, a pot of coffee achieved. By mid-1945, the American military had turned the prison system, inadvertently, into a cultural relay. The first whisper of occupation ideology transmitted through hygiene duties and mess hall seats. Back in Japan, such ideology seemed inconceivable under fire. In the camps, it became lived reality. Women trained to serve were learning to decide when to eat, when to speak, when to sit. That autonomy, microscopic as it seemed, carried potency equal to any proclamation from the U.S. State Department. Power, they discovered, could wear patience instead of force. The coffee pot hissed its last pour. The atmosphere returned to routine. Yet every participant left altered, if not admitting it. The prisoners carried the echo of that shared smell and sound. The Americans, for their part, saw captivity momentarily lose its meaning. Two halves of a war touching briefly in understanding. That hour would find its echo months later, when Japan lay in ashes and Allied authorities entered the homeland, bringing with them not only documents of occupation, but memories of a table where equality had once sat beside surrender. August 1945 arrived not as a sunrise, but as a reckoning. Word of the Emperor's surrender rippled into the compound by whisper, then by formal announcement through crackling loudspeakers. The same Japanese women who had once bowed mechanically now stood upright, staring through barbed wire at a sky that seemed suddenly enormous. Defeat was official, yet the moral polarity of victor and vanquished had already softened within them weeks earlier, on that rain-washed noon of shared labor and coffee. News traveled unevenly. Rumors of atomic destruction curled through the camp. Some nurses fell to their knees. Others stared in mute stillness. The Americans responded with quiet efficiency. No jeers, no boasts, only the new order of occupation beginning even before ships reached Tokyo Bay. In those hours, several prisoners reportedly wept in relief rather than fear. A Red Cross record from 1946 preserves one account. The surrender we heard humbled us, but the Americans had already taken from us hatred. There remained only amazement. The following days blurred practical work with metaphysical shock. Interrogations resumed, not punitive but informational. Medical surveys, documentation of field hospitals, names of missing colleagues. Yet, among the Japanese prisoners, discussion returned not to tactics or loss, but to the cultural phenomenon still fresh in memory: the American table. It had become shorthand for a revelation: the possibility of coexistence without subordination. The table, remembered one nurse decades later, was where we saw power behave like courtesy. Sociologist Ruth Benedict, though distant in Washington, would crystallize this psychological transition in her 1946 monograph, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. To understand defeat is to meet civility where vengeance was feared. She had never visited that camp, yet those words describe its essence. The prisoners had expected victors to indulge humiliation. Instead, they met victors who shared bread. That image, recorded in dozens of Allied intelligence summaries of prisoner morale, became a motif during the early stages of occupation policy. Teach by example, not by force. One physical detail recurs through every testimony: the coffee pot's hiss at dusk. As war ended, the sound persisted, both background and metronome. It punctuated commands, announcements, and the new language of welfare officers discussing repatriation. Many recollections describe this repetition as hypnotic. When the coffee boiled, we knew there would be no gunfire. A stimulus once alien became reassuring. Symbolism matured into emotional conditioning. Democracy distilled into aroma. In Rising at Dawn weeks later, the women no longer averted their gaze from male guards. They met eyes unshaken. The ideological barrier, centuries thick, had thinned to politeness alone. As scholars later wrote, the camps functioned as unintended academies of modern gender. What occupation newspapers attempted to explain through pamphlets about women's suffrage, these prisoners had already experienced bodily. That respect could be as habitual as hierarchy once was. Repatriation orders came in staggered lists. Their return ships waited in Manila Bay, patched hulls and peeling paint gleaming in sharp sunlight. Before departure, one final communal meal was arranged, part farewell, part regulation. An American chaplain read names. A nurse distributed bread rolls. The Japanese women, now in simple khaki replacements for their tattered uniforms, accepted ration tins, and exchanged small bows. Someone produced a camera, framing the group unconsciously at the same tables where revelation first occurred. The photograph survives blurry in an archive in College Park, Maryland. Faces neither jubilant nor broken, only aware. Two sides of a war-sharing presence without barrier. When transport trucks arrived, engines idling, the Americans stood to salute. Not ceremony, instinct. The prisoners responded with the same gesture. It resembled choreographed reconciliation, yet carried no artifice. Formality had yielded to acknowledgement. For historians, such micro-gestures are more potent than treaties, because they record the instant when policy becomes memory. As the convoy rolled toward the dock, the coffee steam drifted again from the mess tent doorways. A breeze carried its scent down the road, mingling with exhaust, sea salt, and the cry of gulls. That smell followed the departing prisoners, imprinted deeper than even the headlines of atomic fire. They would bring it home, proof that another order of life existed, one in which dignity need not demand inequality. Months later, within a ruined Tokyo gutted by firebombs, some of those women would teach hygiene in refugee camps or assist Allied medical units. Observers noted their remarkable composure. One army physician marveled at how these former captives managed patients with calm initiative reminiscent of American hospital practice. The cycle had turned, imitation born of respect. The moment of eating together had evolved from curiosity into creed. It foreshadowed social revolutions of the next decade: women's enfranchisement, labor participation, education reforms. None of these post-war transformations can be traced directly to a single POW camp. Yet the metaphor threads through them. Freedom begins when fear and hierarchy no longer dictate where one may sit. And somewhere behind every post-war classroom lesson and fragile conversation about dignity, the coffee pot still hissed, a background score reminding a defeated generation that equality, once witnessed, is not easily forgotten. When ships bearing the first returning prisoners docked at Uraga Harbor in October 1945, autumn sunlight glinted off the bay like tin. Hard, brilliant, unsentimental. Tokyo lay flattened beyond the horizon, its streets reduced to lattices of wood ash and corrugated ghosts. From the wharf, American medical officers guided each disembarking group through medical inspection, issue of temporary rations, disinfection showers. The immediate business of peacemaking was logistical: prevent disease, process names, repatriate with order. Beneath procedure, however, unseen psychological cargo came ashore. Memories of that peculiar camp where captivity had offered an introduction to another moral vocabulary. For the returning women, the homeland felt paradoxically smaller. They had spent months inside wire believing themselves buried alive. Now they walked freely, yet sensed confinement in an older way. Neighbors greeted them with cautious relief, mingled with unspoken suspicion. To have lived under enemy control, especially for women, carried faint stigma. The code of silence, relic of Imperial training, resettled around them like winter fog. But within, something moved. They had seen compassion delivered by those they had been taught to despise. They had watched authority expressed through courtesy rather than fear. No Imperial slogan could annul that vision. Government. Statistics document approximately 3,400 female non-combatant returnees throughout late 1945 and 1946. Many were absorbed into the new structures of occupation rebuilding. Clerical posts in ministries revamped under Allied supervision. Hospital wards managed by a growing corps of domestic nurses trained through U.S. Army public health programs. A handful of the Luzon prisoners eventually joined philanthropic or Christian medical missions, explaining to younger recruits how the enemy boiled coffee. Their tone was neither awe nor irony. It was shorthand for the discovery that civilization could survive power. Japanese newspapers, newly resurrected under strict censorship, began publishing serialized human interest reports on repatriated prisoners. In Asahi Shimbun that November, a dispatch titled "Women of the Lost Empire Return" quoted an anonymous nurse describing America's camp life. She said only, "There were men and women, and they spoke as equals while eating." To most readers, mourning sons and brothers, this sounded trivial. Yet tucked within its simplicity lay the fracture of centuries. The image affronted conservatives and comforted reformists simultaneously. Was this defeat or renewal? Occupation authorities noticed. General Headquarters, Psychological Warfare Section, PWB, collected the clippings and concluded that accounts of humane confinement reinforced democratic objectives. In plain words, kindness was propaganda more effective than pamphlets. Thus began the soft axis of transformation, linking private recollection to national reconstruction. Those small camp encounters became prototypes for the broader civic re-education soon to spread through textbooks, media, and legislation granting women political voice. The arithmetic of survival remained grim. Malnutrition and trauma followed repatriation. Frost-bitten limbs, tropical fevers, malaria relapses. Yet in numerous interviews compiled by the Japanese Red Cross in 1947, survivors identified one element that helped them endure reintegration: the memory of ordinary decency. They associated its symbol, the coffee cup, with an ethic of steady purpose. One particularly moving entry reads, "When I need courage among ruins, I remember that smell of coffee under rain." Scholars often quote this sentence as emblem of sensory democracy, the idea that equality first reaches the senses before the mind. Humanitarian observers traced another phenomenon: improved empathy among those women toward civilians of defeated status, especially war widows and orphans. Where imperial social codes once demanded stratification, these nurses practiced a quiet inclusivity learned across barbed wire. Several became mentors within nursing schools established under the 1948 public health law reforms, integrating American patient care methods, emphasizing dignity regardless of class. Through them, the chain of transmission continued. The democratic table transformed into bedside courtesy. Not all accepted the change. Elders and former officers sometimes rebuked the women's Western ways, accusing them of betraying tradition. But moral conviction hardened rather than weakened inside quiet restraint. Most dissenters lacked the sensory proof these women held, the recollection of decency etched in flavor and fragrance. Ideology cannot erase aroma. Across the Pacific, American documentation too preserved the aftermath. The U.S. Army's 1946 Report on Japanese Civilian and Prisoner Morale observed that many female internees returned home bearing signs of social adaptability uncommon prior to capture. It was bureaucratic phrasing for what psychology calls perspective shift, pattern recoherence after shock. The administrators who filed those forms could not imagine their analysis would describe a subtler triumph, a moral victory that had unfolded in silence, without orders, born of a meal shared during rain. Even now, that campsite on Luzon is overgrown. Survey maps mark only faint foundations of huts. Vines coil along cracked concrete where mess tables once stood. Yet locals occasionally unearth relics: a rusted spoon, fragments of steel mugs, thermos lids warped by time. Each artifact whispers the same narrative: equality, distilled into metal, surviving where flags have faded. Soon, a wider ripple would carry those ideals beyond individual memory, into the rebuilding of a nation's conscience. For within post-war Japan's first social reforms, echoes of that humble coffee pot can still be heard, hissing quietly under bureaucratic paperwork and political speeches alike. Winter 1946 settled cold over Japan's torn industrial plain. Cities resembled shipwrecks, chimneys without factories, bridges without roads, citizens queuing for millet gruel under the gray breath of occupation trucks. And yet within this almost lunar desolation, new ideas rooted quietly, disguised as routine. The women who had once eaten beside their captors now taught others to wash hands, to organize food lines, to boil water for safety. Habits learned through the enemy's efficiency. They were teaching democracy's etiquette without ever naming it. Public health campaigns, backed jointly by the U.S. Army's Public Health and Welfare Section and emerging Japanese local committees, recruited many of these returnees. Records list them as experienced in field discipline and sanitation. No files mention ideology, but witnesses recall the precision with which they managed male subordinates. A hierarchy reversed by war now functioned smoothly in practice. Where once propriety forbade women from instruction, necessity sanctified their new authority. The symbolic object of that change, coffee, spread again through occupation trade. American roasters imported beans into Yokohama warehouses. GIs traded tins for souvenirs. By 1946, cafes reopened in Tokyo's surviving districts. Inside them, Japanese customers tasted the same bitterness those POW nurses had first sipped in captivity. Writers of the era used it frequently as metaphor. Author Tamura Tai, a repatriated dietitian, wrote in her diary, "The taste of coffee no longer belongs to one side. It is the taste of possibility." Within months, Kissaten coffee shops became small temples of conversation where students discussed rights, literature, and peace under portraits of MacArthur and the Emperor alike. Statistically, transformation materialized in policy. The 1946 Constitution granting suffrage to women, the 1948 Labor Standards Act equalizing wages, the growing enrollment of female students in universities once closed to them. But beneath the paperwork lay intangible prelude, the personal familiarity with equality absorbed by those who had witnessed it, lived casually at mess tables. In symbolic lineage, one could trace from a camp's coffee kettle to the constitutional debates shaping Article 14's declaration that all of the people are equal under the law. Legislators might cite philosophy. The women recalled an aroma. Across the Pacific, Allied officials viewed these developments pragmatically. For them, social reform validated victory. Yet in internal memoranda preserved in Washington, one finds unexpected humility. Officers admitting they had underestimated the potency of mundane behavior. A 1947 report from the Civil Information and Education section stated, "Democratic conduct, when incidentally observed by defeated people, attains credibility unreachable by broadcast." It was the academic codification of what a cup of coffee had done spontaneously. As post-war years advanced, memories congealed into oral history. Repatriated nurses aging into teachers and midwives became carriers of a rare bridge between militarism and modernity. Interviews decades later reveal near-poetic recall. One summarized the experience with austere brevity. "Defeat taught us hunger. Humanity taught us taste." Another observed that after war, the sound of cups on tables was gentler than prayers. Historians reading these phrases note their structure: sensory before abstract, survival before interpretation. Democracy, when born of trauma, often begins through the body. By 1950, Japan was reshaping itself with American loans, domestic diligence, and pragmatic humility. New hospitals rose over ruins. Sewing machines hummed through factory sheds once devoted to aircraft frames. In every layer of reconstruction, an invisible lineage persisted from that rainy camp. Rational order without arrogance, cooperation beyond gender. Sociologists later measured the shift as collective defeminization of obedience, a dull phrase for an extraordinary liberation. Not all survivors spoke. Some maintained silence, their transformation personal and private. But even their quiet choices revealed the change. They married men who accepted partnership, sent daughters to school, insisted that mealtime be shared rather than served. Small rebellions replicated the larger event. The empire had taught them to bow. Democracy taught them to sit. Around the old campsites of the Pacific, vegetation reclaimed memory. Yet sometimes locals reported phantom scents, wood smoke tinged with faint bitterness, as though a forgotten urn still boiled somewhere under vines. It serves today as folkloric metaphor among historians tracing the scent theory of post-war democratization, that ideas most enduring circulate not through decrees, but through air, taste, repetition. By the time Japan signed its peace treaty in 1951, the lessons from those barbed wire mess huts had already crystallized into cultural instinct. Respect no longer implied distance. Humility no longer demanded silence. Even language changed, phrases of command giving way to softer verbs of cooperation. What began as the uneasy sharing of a table ended as an architectural principle of society. Equality constructed not from ideology, but from memory, and so, within the noise of rebuilding and the quiet of individual conscience, the hum of that wartime coffee kettle still resonated, steady, persistent, democratic in rhythm, reminding a nation that generosity can endure even where victory once fell silent. The war ended on paper long before it ended in memory. Its noise faded, its maps were redrawn, but the subtler front, the one inside conscience, lingered. In that invisible campaign, a shared meal achieved what invasion could not. Translation of values through ordinariness. For the Japanese women who once served an emperor conceived as divine, the act of sitting beside men and strangers, sharing imperfect coffee, became an unintentional sacrament of equality. They learned that power need not roar, and generosity need not bow. Historians often measure peace by treaties, yet peace is sustained by habits. In 1945, democracy entered Japan not with banners, but with utensils. Men and women eating together, unarmed, became the first tableau of genuine coexistence after the apocalypse. That tableau survived every reconstruction plan, surviving even in the reflex gestures of kindness that rebuilt hospitals, classrooms, and homes. Respect, stripped of ceremony, had become civic oxygen. The coffee's hiss, the film of steam curling above dented metal, remains the story's pulse. It binds hunger to hope, bitterness balanced by warmth. The metaphor fits both beverage and history. Its sound on that rain-soaked afternoon echoed the steady rhythm of freedom, unassuming, repetitive, impossible to silence once heard. When the last prisoners returned home and cities rose from ashes, they carried more than scars. They carried the memory of how humanity had once sat down, evenly and without command. In the archive of the 20th century, this image rests quietly among the grander scenes of surrender ceremonies and ruined capitals, no less significant for its humility. Because sometimes civilization begins anew not in triumph, but in the courage to pour a second cup for those once called enemies.